Good afternoon. I'm Todd Lyons. I am the panel chair for Accelerating Innovation, which is Revitalizing Industrial Surge Capacity and Manufacturing Security. I am the Executive Vice President of the Naval Postgraduate School Foundation and also serve as a volunteer faculty member at the Naval Postgraduate School, focused on innovation leadership. So this is a topic that is near and dear to my heart. We want to welcome you to the Naval Postgraduate School's 23rd Annual Acquisition Research Symposium. It is hosted by the Acquisition Research Program in the Department of Acquisition, Finance, and Manpower. As we have this panel, I am joined by John Matlik and Katy Buda. We will begin with some brief opening remarks from each one, followed by presentations from each of our panelists. I encourage you to put your questions into the Q&A as we go throughout the event. And then after the panelists have done their presentations, I'll begin bringing those questions to them and identify who we're bringing that from. And then we'll should have plenty of time for your questions as we get into the panel. I'm really interested in pursuing this topic for a number of reasons. One, it's obvious that we need to revitalize our industrial surge capacity, and we're going to have a really good discussion on that. And we really need to rethink how we're doing manufacturing security. I would reflect that in the 90s, we obviously had the Last Supper, and it was a deliberate attempt to narrow down the defense industry, to streamline it, to make it smaller. And it was remarkably successful at doing that in a whole host of ways. And over time, what we've realized is we need to take those moats away and really revitalize that capacity, not just among those top tier performers, but also the second and third tier suppliers that are so vital to the manufacturing capability and security of our country. I would put all of this under the framework of, the arsenal of innovation is obviously a takeoff of Arthur Herman's Freedom's Forge and the work that he did on the arsenal of democracy as we led up to World War II, because we were hopelessly behind in terms of being able to move industrial capacity before the war. And, it chronicles the leadership and the decisions that were made to get us into a position that we were able to surge capacity when required. And so as we get into the panel, I just want to have that as a context for this broader conversation. And now I want to invite our two panelists to give a brief opening on introducing themselves, what brings them to this topic, and also kind of the bottom line up front before we get into the detailed presentations. John?
Hey, thanks, Todd. So John Matlik, fellow at Northrop Grumman Aeronautics Systems. I've been at Northrop Grumman for a couple of years. I came to Northrop from a 20-year career at Rolls-Royce Liberty Works. So I've got experience at a couple of different tier levels and experienced some of the opportunities and challenges associated with cross-supply chain engagement. Why I am passionate about this topic leads to another hat that I'm bringing to the panel, and that is I am the chair of the NDIA Industrial Surge Working Group. And as a part of that activity, back in about 2021, industry had had started with some pretty robust conversations with the government. The government kind of pressed into industry for a while and said, hey, why don't we have any surge capacity? And the industrial general response at that point in time was because you're not paying for it. And the kind of pain point that we were feeling from our team was, hey, that can't just be the final answer. We need to kind of figure out how do we move the needle forward? What can we do together and collaborate to move out on that? So we formed this industrial surge working group that had partnership with the government, with academia, with industry to say, how might we better tackle that problem and get capability to the hands of the warfighter at the speed of the need that is becoming even faster as we're going forward. So my desire, my passion is to connect the dots on that. And we moved away from sort of an initial focus on an industrial buy plan to proposing a playbook and framework for how do we connect kill chain to supply chain. And I'm excited to talk about that on my briefing today. Back to you, Todd.
Outstanding. Thank you, John. Katy, over to you.
Hi, I'm Katy Buda. I'm the Associate Director at the Center for the Industrial Base at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, better known as CSIS. So the Center for the Industrial Base was stood up this summer. It is originally, if you've heard of the Defense Industrial Initiatives Group, DIG, that's what we were before. The goal of setting up the center is to widen the scope and look at the industrial base as a whole and kind of think about how the ecosystem works, especially with companies that aren't traditionally defense companies, and think about how the U.S. can approach manufacturing and getting capabilities into our warfighters' hands in a more kind of holistic view. And I've been here about 3.5 years. And then before this, I was a research intern at the Army War College in Carlisle, looking at a strategy for national security emergencies. But my work here has been more acquisition focused and the industrial base, export controls, icebreaker cooperation, how also Australia and the US can cooperate, especially in dual use capabilities. And then right now, leading what we'll get into with the presentation is being the junior staff lead for our manufacturing security program project. So thinking about surge and how we also kind of coordinate responses across industry and government and think of this as everyone moving towards the same goal.
Outstanding. Thank you, Katy. I would also, as we frame this, we talked about in the 90s, a period of consolidation and great integration. What we're seeing now is the need for greater disaggregation, disintegration, decentralization, but also being able to do that within an understandable framework that allows us to be able to identify priorities, but also not necessarily just pick specific winners and losers that make it smaller. And there is a book that I will just refer to kind of, again, allow the audience to research and think about this. And it's one called The Spider and the Starfish. Latest edition, I think, was released in 2006. But it talked about when you cut off the spider's leg, you kill the spider. When you cut off the starfish's arm, you grow a new starfish. And so part of that is thinking about as we move, the primes are still going to have a role in this new world. But when you talk to primes like Boeing and RTX and Lockheed Martin and others, they really rely on mergers and acquisitions in order to drive innovation, because a lot of what happens internally ends up being more incremental based on things that have already been done before. The other way that they drive innovation is through cooperative research and development agreements with academia. And John, you mentioned that earlier. And so as we think about industrial surge capacity, we're not merely thinking about a factory, we're thinking about it holistically. And how do we bring all of those assets together to drive it? The other thing that I just put for our audience to think about as we go through this is the role that each one can play. If you're in academia, in government, in industry, industry builds the things that we need. Government needs to be able to identify the things that we need effectively and then to bring that in a rapid fashion. And academia can play an enormous role in driving talent, which again is part of this broader discussion where education drives outcomes as well. And so again, with that as a background, it's my pleasure to turn it over to John Matlik for our first presentation. John, over to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Todd. All right, so first context here, you mentioned about how do we bring the ecosystem of folks together, all the folks that need to come together under a framework to allow us to connect the demand signals that are rapidly emerging on the battlefield to a supply chain response. And that's really the purpose and the sharing of the research work that we've done as a part of the NDIA Industries-led Surge Working Group. And I just want to do a big shout out to my co-authors, Dr. Mike McGrath, a research fellow at the Acquisition Innovation Research Center, and Dr. Olivia Fisher, principal research engineer at Georgia Institute of Technology, for helping collate a lot of information and work that we've done over the last few years, since about 2021. Main goal of the presentation show how a coordinated ecosystem can translate combat-ready demand into rapid industrial surge capability. Next slide, please. So if you've been listening to much of the conference so far, you've heard a lot of the good baseline, but to kind of make sure we go through that, the bottom line is that the U.S. Defense Industrial Base has consolidated. We've offshored manufacturing. We've become fragile and brittle due to a lot of just-in-time supply chain activities. In that context, our team was looking at how do we better prepare the U.S. in peacetime for a potential surge response. In a world where speed of supply chain response to battlefield needs is going to become increasingly important. So historically, we've seen that large-scale mobilizations take years. We don't have that luxury today. In today's world, if needed, we need to figure out how we develop a plan that allows us to very rapidly switch on production. And we're talking in months or weeks. We're not talking about years. So how do we prepare for this? That's the challenge that we kind of tackled, and we want to come back with some recommendations on. Next slide, please. So Dr. McGinn in his earlier session did kind of highlight this graphic already, but I wanted to kind of point out that we in the US haven't really seen a wartime economy since World War II, which was about 80 years ago. During World War II, we were, if you look at defense spending in terms of gross domestic product, we were at about 40%. By comparison, today, Ukraine in 2024 allocated about 34% of its GDP to defense, sort of validating that rough wartime economy scale of spend. So our current US spending is more on the order of 4% GDP, which is an order of magnitude lower than the wartime economy level of that 40%. So I just want to highlight that. It's kind of an eye-opening chart, but it provides a fiscal baseline that underscores why proactive industrial surge planning is essential to identify what needs to be put in place to realize surge capacity that we hope we never have to use. Vice Admiral English in the panel earlier today said it really well. He said that we have to pivot from our mindset of peacetime efficiency to wartime resilience. So what does that look like? Next slide, please. Big part of that is to really focus our planning and understanding what demand signals really look like. So in our research, we found that we can use scenario-driven wargaming and discrete event modeling and simulation to generate realistic demand profiles for munitions, spares, and consumables. We've done that on a suite of realistic but fictional scenarios to kind of identify and give us a way to quantify peak burn rates and maintenance spikes, things like battle damage that are influenced by battle damage, component failure, so that the surge resources can be sized correctly over multiple timelines. Time phasing is important. Operationally coupled demand quantification is important. That feeds directly into identifying the plans and the switches, the surge switches that trigger surge productions needed to keep the kill chain flowing. So we've demonstrated as a part of our NDIA work patterns for how to do that using realistic but fictional scenarios and data. To take it forward, we need to do it for real. So what has been progressed so far in the Department of War? Next slide, please. I wanted to kind of highlight, we have a really great foundation in the U.S. Department of War acquisition transformation strategy. It's situating us to be much better positioned for a wartime footing. The initial work that's gone on so far has done a great job at helping better prepare us to scale the ecosystem across 5 strategic pillars. Mr. Potter earlier today mentioned about 38 acquisition reform initiatives that are underway as a part of this morning's keynote. Some examples of those are captured in this slide, but one of the things I wanted to key theme and hit down one more time on the slide, I think we've got another animation on this slide. Yep, thank you, is to emphasize that based on our research, there is a acquisition and transformation strategy focus on commercial solutions and commercial contracting. That is particularly important in the landscape we're facing now. And just wanted to reference the Civil Reserve Manufacturing Network efforts that are underway. It's modeled after the Civil Reserve Air Fleet, but it points to how we can open the door to suppliers who have the workforce and capacity that's needed that is orders of magnitude bigger than current Department of War peacetime demands. We can't align on or rely on only the defense system, defense traditional suppliers today. We've got to be able to consider how do we scale significantly, and that requires an engagement with the commercial landscape and the non-traditionals. If we pre-plan appropriately, this can enable the commercial industrial base to switch over to defense production when needed. Next slide, please. So what does that ecosystem look like? And hit down one more time on the, thank you. To enable rapidly linking kill chain demand with the supply chain response, this does require an ecosystem. If coordinated correctly, the supply chain becomes part of getting inside our enemy's OODA loop, or to reference the really powerful quote, the supply chain then becomes the kill chain in some senses. Our research has identified 4 key elements for the ecosystem and how they enable the 5 pillars of the U.S. Department of War acquisition transformation strategy. First, operational users. They're the ones that communicate what they need. They also consume what's provided to address some of those rapidly emerging battlefield needs and effects. The industrial base makes and delivers the weapon systems and the capabilities that the warfighter needs, CONUS and OCONUS. So here in the U.S. and with strategic partners from an international ecosystem and a partner perspective. How do you securely tie all that together? We can leverage what didn't exist in World War II as a digital infrastructure and a backbone. This is the backbone to facilitate continuous and digitally enabled collaboration across ecosystem partners in a way that is secure and federated. And then finally, we need strategic governance to kind of coordinate. How do we pull all these things together? And this drives coordination through authorities, metrics, partnership structures, and then contract mechanisms. Next slide, please. So much of today's efforts to prepare for our wartime footing has been very focused on O-plan driven, sort of short duration, intense surge with a strong focus on munitions that looks into a lot of conflicts that are more on the term of 60 to 90 days. So I'm going to add a time dimension on the framework that we're proposing and we brought forward from our industrial surge working group. And to ensure ability for us as a U.S. to respond to prolonged and longer term conflicts, we really must establish a framework that goes beyond the initial conflict planning. Our research has resulted in a proposed surge playbook and framework that proactively establishes what we've been calling these switches that we need to be able to flip to enable rapid whole economy surge capability. The pre-planned switches referenced here include things like surge-capable RFPs, playbook for Defense Production Act activation, what a rapid supply chain expansion looks like, and stockpile programs like the War Stopper program for DLA. We see that there's a big opportunity here to jointly work with the government and industry to develop this surge playbook and framework, which we could almost view as a national asset. It allows us and provides the foundation for going from plowshares to swords with commercial and non-traditional partners, as well as prepping the traditional folks and the systems integrators today for how do we best work together. We don't want to have to share our business cards on the battlefield. We need to be able to do that proactively ahead of time and practice before we have to do a main go and execute the conflicts. So that surge playbook can provide a repeatable pattern for any theater and time horizon that we need to look at. Kind of think about it as the foundation for a preemptive break glass surge plan that aligns industrial capacity with dynamic logistics demands and in a high intensity conflict context. So with all of that said, and with all the context I've just said, the next slide is going to speak into some of the key recommendations that we would want to bring forward. First, continuous wargaming. So we've established a pattern for this, and we'd asked that we would leverage lessons learned from the work that we've already done. However, we do need to consolidate and get an owner accountable in the Department of War that will consolidate the estimates of that demand, those demand profiles from short and extended conflicts, and help drive more of a constant and controlled demand signal to help industry respond. The intention here would also be to meet continuously. So this would be a continuous collaboration. And the goal there would be to position ourselves to be able to respond to emerging threats. Second key recommendation is around an industrial mobilization board. We don't have that anymore. We haven't since 1945. But the goal here in the recommendation would be to establish a modern industrial mobilization board for a whole of nation response and coordinated effort focused on specific sectors to kind of build out. This is beyond what has been established from some of the things in the current acquisition transformation strategy, beyond the business operations for national defense activities like the bond initiative. The goal here would be to align these mobilization boards with critical manufacturing sectors based on the demand quantification and prioritization from the previous recommendation. And this is where you can engage and pull in a group to respond to that, like the Civil Reserve Manufacturing Network. Third, we need to build out the digital ecosystem. We want to accelerate secure access to technical data that's needed for things like repairs, supply chain expansion, visibility of supply chain capability and capacity beyond just the larger systems integrators into the tier 2 to tier N partners. What does that look like? Making sure that we're able to leverage the current momentum that industry has been moving out on in terms of establishing collaborative open digital ecosystems. So the architecture and the structure to work, the digital and data standards that exist to allow to make data machine discoverable, machine readable, machine interpretable, and then allowing us to move more towards continuous collaboration between government and industry through continuous VV&A. And then finally, just how do we better leverage things like OTA consortia and pre-work so that we get visibility into the supply chain capability and capacity we need. And then finally, and fourth recommendation is proactive industry engagement. We definitely recommend working proactively with industry associations. The output of what we're sharing here is something that we did in many cases on our own time, trying to move forward and show how we could move forward together. It's also a mechanism to obtain broad industry input on how to align government and industry interests in preparing for mobilization contingencies. And then finally, under that industry collaboration, developing that surge playbook as a national asset for how we rapidly pivot the broader industrial base, commercial and defense, from peacetime to wartime footing is something that we would advocate for. So last slide in summary, and to close out my comments. We must proactively develop and integrate the tools and processes to rapidly connect kill chain to supply chain. We must leverage established lessons learned and best practices. We've all been doing wonderful things, but in many cases have been done in siloed. We need to continue to collaborate and come together. One of those was the scenario planning and the demand quantification lessons learned we've had. We want to drive clear plans for realizing surge capacity. We must expand the foundational Department of War acquisition transformation pillars to close identified gaps for industrial mobilization and readiness. And we must jointly develop a surge framework and playbook that establishes the needed switches for campaigns of multiple time horizons. And then just finally, we believe that adopting our recommended actions will ensure the U.S. is surge ready and establishing that mobilization capability that we hope we never have to use, but we don't want to have to try to pull together at the last minute on the battlefield. So thank you so much for your time, and back to you, Todd.
John, thank you so much. And you obviously have raised a number of great issues that we'll explore more in the Q&A. I will just highlight that the idea of the supply chain is the kill chain is an incredibly powerful one. The other one that we can explore more in the Q&A is that the supply chain is the strategic deterrent for our country. And I think the current conflicts really lead into that well. So we'll talk more about that following the presentation by Katy. And again, Katy, really looking forward to your presentation. So over to you.
Thanks, Todd, and thanks, John. I think you'll find a lot of the slides I'll be presenting, and this work is going to be very harmonious with what John just presented. And I'm sure a lot of other presentations from today and then tomorrow. So the purpose of this project, the Establishing Manufacturing Security Program, was really to think about all the different efforts underway, but also draw parallels historically to kind of start thinking out, as John mentioned, what are the best practices? So how do we think about these efforts and go after them in the most, effective way, and what are the components that you want of these efforts in order for them to succeed. And so this is a project undertaken by Dr. Jerry McGinn is the PI on this project, but I'm happy to present our work. And this is an ongoing project, so the presentation and the draft submitted are just samples of a longer report that will come out probably about this summer. So next slide. So this project was sponsored by the J4, so logistics for the Joint Staff, and Vice Admiral Dion English. We were really excited to undertake this work because, surge is a difficult but necessary problem to overcome. And the purpose of the project was to think about how, the Department of Defense or Department of War can better effectively work with industry and allies and partners, and more effectively work on our own to build up our ability to quickly produce munitions and other critical capabilities. This project followed 3 roundtables in this past summer. We had one with industry, one with subject matter experts, and another with allies. And that kind of formed our just broad basis of understanding around the different issues and the things we might want to look into. And then we formed the project, which was looking at 7 main case studies, which I'll get to on the next slides. Also a TTA, oh, sorry, not yet. If you could go back one, thank you. A tabletop exercise where we had people come from industry, former government officials, subject matter experts. I think we also had some representation, yes, from congressional staffers. So really great exercise that we were able to hold. And all of this has kind of culminated in the work so far. This is going to be focused on the findings, whereas the recommendations are going to come out with the final report. And next slide. And so what we are thinking about with these different case studies is what are the major components of each, so that we had a basis of how to judge their effectiveness. So we split the case studies into what are their authorities and policies, what are their mechanisms of government industry collaboration, what are the resources necessary for these efforts, and what are their contracting approaches, and then how are they activated or utilized. And then, as you can see on the slide, what that meant, authorities and policies, pretty straightforward. Are, some programs were authorized through the Defense Production Act. Others used Title III funding. There were a range of mechanisms that became part of also the organizational structure. Some were through government, some were across, Department of Transportation and, Department of Defense. Some were just private-led efforts, and then there were different contracting mechanisms. Some were more of soft requisition programs, so it wasn't really about producing a capability, but more kind of acquiring what our commercial capacity is currently. Some programs had very clear incentive structures. Companies participating would receive this amount per year. Others, it was more about the business opportunities or the relationships built. And then some were basically standby plans that hadn't been used yet, and some had been activated or were, very robust efforts that are continually used each year. So we saw a wide range. Next slide. And then for the case studies, the 7 case studies were the Voluntary Tinker Agreement and the Tinker Security Program, the Voluntary Intermodal Sea Lift Agreement, also known as VISA, and the Maritime Security Program. the voluntary agreement with private sector to assist in pandemic response. That was during COVID. The Civil Reserve Air Fleet, as John had mentioned, or CRAF. And then we originally had just had the National Armaments Consortia and the Munitions Campus, but then as efforts were underway and we learned more about it, we added on in the middle of the research the Civil Reserve Manufacturing Network. So we wanted to show a kind of large scope of what are different efforts around increasing capabilities or increasing capacity that could be relevant to our surge efforts today, and how do we examine each with a rough score of high. So in this component, the effort is really clearly defined for either their authorities and policies or a really clear incentive network for their government industry collaboration. For medium, it would be that, you know, maybe there are the mechanisms in place, but they're not really utilized or they're not as effective. And then low is possibly some component of it led it to be ineffective, not able to be used, or it's like set up too late in, you know, in reference to the COVID voluntary agreement, which we'll get to. So that was how we, that was the metric we used to score all of the case studies. Next slide. So starting with visa and MSP, these slides are pretty dense, but so I'm going to go through them on a quicker note, but the paper submitted has the research, and you can definitely go back and see how we understood and rated all of these components. For visa, we were really impressed with it as a case study. Really high effectiveness for authorities and policies, good government industry relationships and collaboration, really clear business incentives, and during peacetime, strong congressional support. And then there was strong utilization in terms of the peacetime mechanism, but it hadn't been activated. So that was kind of where we gave the medium score. And that's what we'll get down the line into kind of our findings and also how we looked at the other programs. And then for the MSP, the Maritime Security Program, that is the kind of incentive program to get people to participate in visa. So that's why they're separated out, but they are kind of one full effort. Next slide. And then we have the voluntary tanker agreement and then its incentive program, the tanker security program. This one was less effective than visa. So while it has more clear operating procedures, it is more of a standby agreement. And then there's regular government industry collaboration, but it's not really the clear business, peacetime business that visa has. It's just not as prevalent with those opportunities, and that translates into also the much smaller group of companies that are a part of it than are a part of visa. And so, you know, that's just the incentive structure of, you know, kind of few peacetime business opportunities has the effect of, you know, it's not going to be used as much. There's not going to be as many participants. And then the other thing is it just has poor utilization and hasn't been, you know, activated in the way of some of the later case studies that we'll get into. And so this one overall was kind of a medium to low case study. Good ideas and plans, but execution just did not turn out to be totally effective. Next slide. So for COVID, the biggest issue for this voluntary agreement is that it was just set up way too late. And this gets into also the goal of kind of why we have to think about these efforts in the now, and not as if something comes up later, we can think about surge or response or, you know, voluntary agreements. We have to think about it as what are we preparing well in advance, and this is a very clear, obvious reason. So as you can see, we had, sorry, can we go back a slide? Thanks. As you can see, it was set up too late. It wasn't really able to be effective. There's good collaboration in creating it, but there were it wasn't clear, kind of, they should have narrowed down kind of which industries were involved, and it just wasn't able to be effective. Next slide. And then CRAF is very successful, has been used often, strong congressional support, great collaboration between government and industry, really kind of long-standing relationships, really effective. Next slide. I think we're running more out of time, so I'm going to go through these a little faster. National Armaments Consortium, also very effective. Broad membership and really clear avenues for companies to get contracts with the government, for government to message their needs and what they're looking for and set requirements. So very, very clear program, and it's very effective at what it's set out to do. It's longest running DoD consortium. The only thing is it's not as much, it's more for kind of early research than it is for kind of large scale production efforts. Next slide. The next two that we'll show are, still kind of in progress early on. So we wanted to really highlight that with these scores. This is, nothing set in stone. Munitions campus next to the Crane facility. This is run by ACMI, and it's looking at kind of creating this model of having a tenant vendor, smaller vendors around it, where they are kind of leasing this production space, and it's really about integrating in, emerging tech companies and new suppliers, and we found it kind of medium effective overall. And that is just because many of the features of it we just haven't seen yet because it's still, they just broke ground. Next slide. And then lastly, the Civil Reserve Manufacturing Network. Very clear government authorization, a lot of support going into it. But again, it's similar to the Munitions Campus. It's just being formed. It's just being figured out. So we'll have to kind of stay tuned to see how effective it is. Next slide. And then this is just the scores overall. Next slide. Next slide. So overall, for authorities and policies, what we found is you need a clear organization structure. You need to only have the relevant industry members and not broaden your scope too much, like with the COVID VA. You also need it set up in advance, like with the COVID VA. You need to, and this is especially true for all voluntary agreements, they need to be regularly used and authorized. Otherwise, government offices are going to lose the institutional knowledge to set them up. Antitrust exemptions can be really helpful, but they also take a significant amount of lead time in getting put in place. So it should first be determined whether you can have the government industry information sharing without it, and then if you can't have the level you need, then going to the antitrust exemption. Next slide. For government industry collaboration, one's pretty obvious. Industry needs to have a clear incentive structure. So if that's peacetime business, if that's a yearly kind of financial program where they're going to, for their participation, they're going to receive this payment per year or per vessel. That needs to be in place. You can't just say that this is kind of, what you think will eventually lead to increased business. You need to have it be very obvious and clear, and companies need to see those kind of rewards on the sooner side than the later. And you need to kind of not underestimate the importance of those incentive structures. And then again, part of what can help that is the antitrust exemptions, but they should be focused on specific programs or industry subsegments. Next slide. Resources and contracting. Obviously, you need continual funding. You should think about, the range of funding that can come just from the government. That can also be from, as we're seeing more efforts looking at bringing in venture capital. And you need to have a really clear demand signal for industry. What are their peacetime business opportunities, and how, what are you expecting of them for wartime capacity? And there's different contract mechanisms. We saw with the NAC that they have a really clear OTA model. It's, very effective for getting to the exact, sub-industry level that you need to bring in those contracts, and they build great relationships. Next slide. And then this one, which again kind of touches on John's slide and references to wargaming and different efforts. All of these have to be, if they're not activated, they have to be tested out. So you really have to have strong and clear utilization. And so even if there's not activation, these standby agreements, you can run exercises, you can kind of figure out, very clear steps of activation of, okay, if this happens, then we need to go to this level, and this is how it's going to get authorized, and this is how the demand signal is going to be sent to industry, and this is the capacity or, the production that's going to ramp up. Having that really clearly stated and then also exercised, even if not activated, is really important. Next slide. So overall, clear authorities and policies, robust participation incentives, clear demand signals, strong utilization. All of those things show how, we can approach best practices. But then the key thing is you need someone to coordinate those best practices, which again is, I think works well with John's presentation, and the same kind of messaging is you need some kind of cross-DOW coordination. And you need a really clear mechanism or body that's going to kind of drive all of these different surge efforts and make them the most effective version they can be and the most harmonious that they could be with each other. And next slide. And that's it.
Outstanding, Katie. Thank you for another great presentation. And I think you and John really raised a number of good issues. We've got several questions that are in the chat. I actually am going to start with one that, I had, kind of formulated ahead of this, because I do think it is important to think about. If you, imagine you have the opportunity to engage with the Deputy Secretary of War, Stephen Feinberg, on this topic. What is the one idea or practice that you would highlight to him that he should implement that would make the greatest contribution to our national security based on your findings? And John, let's start with you.
Okay, yeah, can you hear me?
We can.
Okay, good. So one thing, I think it comes down to this idea, and it's consistent with my presentation. How do we connect the kill chain demand to the supply chain at the speed of relevance? And so if I were to break that out just a little bit more, first key step to that, right, is getting the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the services to really quantify what that demand looks like, not just for short term, but for extended conflicts with peer adversaries, not near peers, and understand what that signal and that demand looks like. Second, once you have the outcomes of that, share it with Congress, share it with cleared industry so that there's an awareness there, and ideally partner and collaborate as you're going through that process. And then finally, it's like, now that you know what that demand signal is and you can kind of feed and understand how that feeds down into the supply base, if we really want to prepare resiliency and growth of the industrial base, you've got to go beyond the conventional defense landscape into the civil landscape. So leverage and implement that with a partnership in the Civil Reserve Manufacturing Network accordingly. I think a lot of the patterns that we kind of developed on the NDIA efforts would love to partner with the Grumman effort. And if they identified that there were some questions about how far along have we gotten, I think, as you highlighted, Katie, that it's kind of medium right now because it's so early. We would love to partner to say, how do we make sure that we can accelerate the realization of the value and the need of that? Because the engagement with civil and commercial best practices and contracting is so important. So that would be my one thing.
Outstanding. Thanks, John. Katie, what's the one thing that you would talk to the Deputy Secretary of War, Stephen Feinberg, about based on your findings?
I would just kind of focus on the broad issue of we, need to possibly make our lives a little more difficult now to make them easier down the line, and that means thinking about programs to be able to surge and not considering them, ineffective uses of money if it's something that's going to really bring in advanced manufacturing capabilities and bring in our ability to switch between commercial and defense production, or to bring in, more suppliers to the defense industrial base. I think it's about really setting up the structure now to be extremely flexible, and that's going to, include different investments and also kind of reworking a lot of programs and how programs talk to each other. This really has to be a whole of government approach. It can't be everyone trying to just pursue their own efforts, because, we don't want unnecessary duplication. We want everyone doing things in the most effective way possible. And so I think it's about, thinking also that all of this is done, for deterrence. The idea is we never have to use all of this, in a perfect world. And the best way to ensure that is to show that we can respond readily at a moment's notice. And so I think that kind of mindset is really important.
Thanks, Katie. And I love, I'll reframe it a little bit, but choose your hard. We can choose to make it hard today, or we can defer that and make it hard when we're actually in the conflict. So I love the way you said that. One of the questions that came up, and it goes directly to something that you were talking about in your comment, Greg Sanders from the Wartime Production Unit asked the question of, have your studies given any sense of the cost or scale of the dedicated workforce time that would be necessary to implement these broader mobilization efforts? Katie, let's start with you. Can you respond to Greg Sanders' question?
Yeah, I'll definitely say when it came to looking at the voluntary agreements, it was obvious that you couldn't have, government personnel that were just brought in or, to set something up that they hadn't been regularly doing. It was really obvious the role of institutional knowledge. So keeping people in government that know how to accomplish these efforts and can deal with the things that take a lot longer, the authorities, setting up the resources, what are our contracting mechanisms going to be? How is this going to look? And, do we need antitrust exemptions or other, that kind of institutional knowledge can't just be outsourced or brought in at a moment's need. You have to have, people in the government that are, continually able to pursue efforts like this. And then when you think of kind of workforce more, a lot of these efforts, case studies were not as production focused, but I think there were still some, lessons in terms of utilizing the workforce in its most effective way. So thinking about how commercial and defense industry can work and integrate and kind of balance each other out, and then bringing in advanced capabilities to kind of limit certain workforce needs, because we've seen, across the defense industry, across a lot of
Right.
manufacturing industries, there's a real inability to kind of recruit the workforce you need. So thinking about how to use our workforce more effectively is really important too.
I want to drill down on one thing that you said, because I think you and your remarks talked about the VISA, the voluntary intermodal CLEP agreement versus the voluntary tanker agreement, one successful, one not as successful. Were you able to see, was there a difference in the number of people that had that institutional knowledge in the visa program versus maybe the tanker agreement that you would also draw the line to? Or is that not something that you looked at?
We didn't go as deeply into workforce, like how many people in each office are running each program, or, how many people are supporting these efforts. But we did see a correlation between, if there's one government our office that's been a longstanding holder or responsible for these programs, that definitely helps in terms of having that institutional knowledge. And if those programs, the longer they're in place, with very importantly, clear incentive for business. So that means that more businesses are involved, and the more businesses that are involved means the more collaboration, and those longstanding, the relationship component is really important. So if you have like someone in Transcom that's been dealing with us for a long time and dealing with the same companies for a long time, those relationships can really be built up where, it's important that people know, okay, if I need this, this is the person I call. And so I think that it's not as much about the numbers of the workforce on these issues. It's about the resources they've been given and the amount of time they've been given to really kind of let certain relationships flourish between government and industry is really important.
Awesome, thank you. And John, I want to ask you if, have your studies given you any sense of the cost and scale of the dedicated workforce time necessary to implement?
Yeah, so I think this ties back a couple things for both scope and cost. I'm going to start with scope. We had a great conversation as a part of an NDIA engagement, wartime production unit. So whoever's on the call asked that question. A great question and timing. It's interesting in talking with you and industrial-based policy and some of the previous JPAC lessons learned and all that. I think the reason we recommended the Industrial Mobilization Board aligned to critical manufacturing sectors is because the scope and the cost for different kind of sector focus areas and the outcomes for those may vary, but it's going to help us if we get a little bit more focused on what those tangible folks are. So I think that would be the first recommendation, is get scoped in. So there are some activities out there now that are aligning around that. I know the wartime production unit is very focused on munitions, right? I mean, and you can now break that down further into the areas of if you look high speeds, hypersonics versus slow speeds, you can look at what does it look like from attritable aircraft, so autonomous collaborative platform type applications, space-based interceptors, all the way up across. And each one of those focus areas is going to have a scope and alignment with it. So we'd recommend to make sure that you pull on that. And as you're identifying those folks, you want to coordinate that, absolutely, but make sure that you're aligning with those critical manufacturing sectors. So that's the first comment on scope. Now, the second thing is, in terms of cost, is that there are patterns that our activity has highlighted that could be repeated across multiple sector focus areas instead of trying to reinvent the wheel for each case. And so I think in that case that you can save a lot of cost. And I know that you're probably looking for an overall raw number on that, but I think the reality is it depends. And if you scope it right, it's going to fall out if you kind of get aligned appropriately to those areas of critical manufacturing sectors. So that's my quick response.
No, that's fantastic. And, again, as we think through these issues, something that you talked about, John, earlier is the need for, VV&A and the use of modeling and simulations in wargaming. We do have a question from Major Seth Brock. He asks, do we have an idea about how we might simulate, verify, validate the industrial mobilization at scale, and then stress test the supply chains under those wartime conditions after we develop and implement some of these policies? So again, do it before, and then once you have a policy intervention, kind of do the war gaming to see if that intervention actually made a difference or not. John, can you speak to that?
So we did establish a pattern for how to connect, and we did this unclassified on purpose, right? So we could get a conversation across a number of folks that were there. We did do 3 different scenarios, from exquisite examples of an F-35 with battle damage to contested logistics scenario contexts that looked at, okay, after about, and then at least the realistic numbers said that after like 100 to 120 days, you're grounding your high value, low volume assets because of you don't have the repair, the parts that the spare parts that you need to address it, down to what is the then affordable mass landscape looks like. But so with that full landscape, we said, how do you go from a scenario, tabletop wargaming type activity into a physics, a discrete event modeling and simulation assessment that drove the definition of sorties all the way through to the demand signal in the supply chain, to the line replaceable units, down to the rare earth elements. We have a framework put in place for that. What we don't have is the right government owner kind of cover so that we can do this with real numbers in a classified space. So we would love, and this is an appeal, I guess, to folks on the call, if there's an opportunity, if somebody wants to run that, we've got patterns and context to bring to bear so that we can connect that dot and run that war game. But we need to do it for real and not just kind of, the higher level. We call them our Tom Clancy scenarios, realistic but fictional, and a big high five to Major General Tim Zadalis, retired Air Force, from a command and control perspective, to kind of helped us flesh out and formulate the scenarios so that they were realistic but fictional so that we could share them. So we're ready to go. If you've got folks that are excited to kind of run that in, please reach out, and we'd love to actually run that war game activity.
Yeah, and John, you're highlighting something that is a great opportunity as well for partnering with NPS, because we've got the warfighter students who own the problem set and are going to be the acquisition professionals down the road. And for those of you that may not know, we are in the process of installing the GB300 from NVIDIA, which will allow us a unique supercompute capability to run these Malian simulations at a level and fidelity that perhaps we've never been able to do before. And so again, great opportunity for collaboration there amongst a number of the different players, especially where a government brings that unique data. Katy, again, thinking about that, how do you think we employ simulation to verify and validate that industrial mobilization at scale?
Yeah, so we had a tabletop exercise as part of our project. It's led by Professor Mark Hansian, who's led several other. I should say several is the lowballing it. Has led many wargaming and tabletop exercises at CSIS, and also specifically looking at potential conflict in the Indo-Pacific. And so that was what our exercise was looking at, was looking at a defense of Taiwan situation. And the idea was kind of start of the conflict, 60 days into the conflict, and then the final session was actually bringing it back to the now and thinking about what is the industrial base response for if we were, what would we go back to at day one after going through the simulation of saying, man, I wish this was in place. And that was really interesting to kind of see, okay, this is what the programs we'd have to be doing right now to even get us close to being, potentially able to respond to some of these scenarios, which, as different war games and marks have shown, is that we've run out of munitions pretty fast. So thinking about, what are the different responses, and also how can, what do we have to get started moving in government right now for these slower components of some of these responses and industrial base efforts, and get things on the books in terms of authorities. And so that was really interesting. And I think war games like that, or tabletop exercises like that, could be really effective. the key is kind of figuring out more ways and towards getting them from the operational standpoint, which is something we really
Right.
worked thoroughly in ours, is getting our participants to kind of take off their operational hats and think of this as just the logistics and like, what do you need? And, so that's always something that's harder to do in these kind of like war games exercises, but I think getting to that is really important.
That's outstanding. Thank you, Katie. And now we got a great question from Ariel Dvorzewski. He asks, how can allied nations move beyond the traditional foreign military sales buyer-seller model and build true strategic industrial partnerships that create a 1 + 1 = 3 effect, where shared production, co-development, digital integration, and surge frameworks generate greater collective readiness, resilience, and wartime manufacturing? He has some other things, but I'll stop there because that's, I think, the essential part of the question. And John, let's start with you.
So great question. So how do we get engagement with our allies? So this is absolutely a part of the ecosystem, and some key themes about how to integrate that. I think there is an important element of ownership here. Who owns the integration of that larger allied ecosystem of partners to make sure that we stay connected and relevant from a strategic perspective? So I'd say like the combatant commands, so the COCOMs, we really need them to involve the allies and perhaps allied industry in some of the war plans and exercises where appropriate, and where we can cover the security for that context. I think that has a very important impact, specifically on the logistics scenarios that we looked at. It does require you to develop a robust and architecture that considers security in terms of how to bring those things in. And it touches on almost all 4 of the ecosystem elements. So how do you do strategic governance? How do you do digital infrastructure? How do you connect in the industrial base, including OCONUS, right? And then how do you like link in some of the JADC2 nodes in the operational user landscape? So from my perspective, it's identifying ownership, leverage the pattern and some of the context that we have, and then drive that demand signal into strategically align with our partners. And we'd love to have that conversation as well. But that's me. Over.
No, thank you. Katy?
Yeah, I think there's, a couple components. One is allies can be involved in more maintenance and repair efforts, especially as we think of potential conflict in the Indo-Pacific and, situations that we don't want to be in where we have to fly something all the way back halfway across the world to get it fixed. And then building on that, also thinking about, co-production and where are there other efforts that we can link co-production. Right now there's a lot of new efforts around ice-breaking capabilities and the Ice Pact, and I think there's a lot of ways that we can instead of trying to overcome hurdles on our own, especially with things we might not have built for like 50 years, really utilizing our allies that are doing it very well and build efforts that even if we want to have some type of resilience and being able to create it on our own, that we're still kind of learning best techniques from our allies and kind of having that type of, tech transfer between allied nations. And one of the strengths of the US is, even if we don't have a certain manufacturing capability or capacity on our own, we have a really strong ally network that we should be utilizing to its fullest. And then thinking about, different RDP agreements, and also an issue with those is getting the messaging down to the acquisition professional that, there's still this kind of want, understandably, to go with an American supplier, even if there's a better, more ready capability from an ally. And, RDP agreements are meant to kind of level the playing field where we are treating allied producers just as we're treating our domestic ones. And I think there are definitely areas where the U.S. should build resiliency and getting, more manufacturing capacity on our own. But then there are other areas where we really should think of, manufacturing capacity as us and our allies as a whole. And we're just much more resilient and flexible in that way. And we don't have to be the expert in every capability or be the top producer in it. You know, if we have these really strong ally frameworks in place, and there's a lot of different agreements looking at this. There's, you know, the Partnership for Indo-Pacific Resilience, there's Piper, there's different programs that are thinking about kind of moving forward together. And I think that's really important, especially with shared standards and interoperability. We should be thinking now of what we need to do so that if we have to pull in allies at different parts, how, you know, everything should be able to work very seamlessly. So, yeah.
No, Katie, that's fantastic. And you know, as we talk about that issue, I do think it's worth, you know, and this may be a study that an MPS student might pick up, which is, you know, what are the things that are currently in foreign military sales or foreign material partnerships that are either best practices that we ought to increase or obstacles that we need to clear out of the way, because there are some successful programs, many of them on a bilateral or, as you indicated, a regional basis, where they are successful at leveraging the capacity, but maybe it's not shared globally across all of the combatant commands and all of the problem sets. So super comments on that. We also have a question from one of our participants who asks, can the surge capacity, again, that we've been talking about, be used as part of the RDT&E research development, test and evaluation environment to proof out new industrial capabilities before they're dropped into production? In other words, while it's not needed in the actual production capacity itself, surging in the sandbox environment prior to surging in the production environment. You know, John, I think this, you know, kind of speaks to something that you were highlighting earlier, right?
So, yes. I mean, that's a simple answer to that, right? I mean, bottom line, establishing demand signals that can, you know, help warm up new participants into the commercial landscape and be able to leverage things like pressure testing exercises, leveraging funding that you want to go show what does this tangibly look like, show new ways of working. If the cash can flow on that, then absolutely, right? I mean, if you're looking at folks that are interested in the landscape, what do small businesses? It's interesting. I was talking to Todd a little bit before on the beginning of the panel about, I'm here in DC. I'm actually headed right after this. I'm headed over to an NDIA manufacturing division meeting and hosting a channel or facilitating a panel on supplying surge. And one of the themes that we get back from tier 2 to tier N folks is, hey, I love it. I get the idea, but I don't operate on wishes, hopes, or dreams. I operate on cash flow to me and orders and purchase orders, right? So what, in terms of understanding and consolidating demand at the top and establishing kind of a robust flow of funds and leveraging all kinds of sources for getting outcomes, tangible outcomes in that community, why not leverage the community of folks stood up with funding to go address the things that you're interested in RDT&E, right? So I think absolutely yes. So that's the longer answer, but you know, the answer is yes. You know, we should absolutely use that and leverage it. Over.
Outstanding. Katie?
Yeah, just to, you know, second what John's saying, I think the more we can think about the surge capacity of a capability and its ability to be produced readily as we're thinking about what we're acquiring and developing, you know, the best capability is not always going to be an exquisite system. It's often going to be something that is easy to make, especially if it's something we don't expect to come back from the battlefield. And, right. You know, just as we've learned with, you know, one of the big issues in acquisition can be that when you have this really tight requirement setting process, there's not always as much input from kind of the operator or the warfighter. And I think in addition to thinking about how a new product works for the operator, we should also be thinking about on day one, how do we produce this and how do we produce this with, you know, the supply chain we have? Is this going to be something that pulls from the same sub tiers where we already have bottlenecks? Is this something that can, be made with different advanced manufacturing capabilities? Can we bring in 3D printing to, produce this? So thinking about, not only does it meet what it needs to do for the warfighter, but is it something that we can produce at scale and surge readily is also really important. And I think a lot of that goes into kind of the contracting process where you have to include that flexibility in the contracts and kind of thinking about them as, how are we going to have those iterations down the road, especially if we learn that there are better ways, if we change this and this, does this capability to do X, Y, and Z need to be built this exact way with this exact material, or are there other ways where we can produce it faster and more effectively if we change small bits? So thinking about that flexibility on all stages.
Awesome. And we're, coming to the end of our panel, but I do want to capture one last question and kind of bring it together for everyone. And, setting aside just the broader Department of War, the congressional level, what's that single highest leverage action that an acquisition professional at the 05, 06, or GS 14, 15 level can take right now within their existing authorities to help move the needle on industrial surge readiness? That's one piece of it. And it goes along with a question from our audience, which was, how do you convince those contractors and subcontractors to maintain and increase capacity when they're not getting funds to keep that capacity if it's not being used? And again, I think this goes to both. So kind of use this as our way of closing out our panel with any final remarks. Katy, let me start with you and we'll finish up with John.
Yeah, so I think that, we definitely have to think about what is the incentive structure for business, and we can't kind of operate on they should do this, or this will be good, or, be prepared. You have to actually have, really straightforward communication. And if you need to create new programs or channels for that, or antitrust exemptions, or whatever method you need to do, industry needs to know what government needs. So they need now, 5 years, 10 years. And there also has to be a really clear incentive structure in terms of if they're going to build up the ability to have this excess capacity, what does that look like? This is included in contracts now where you're saying, okay, well, you're going to be able to provide this much now, but we also want you to, either create the ability to produce more or be storing more, or how are we going to think about having that capacity in place, or are we going to incentivize you to build in more? When we think about advanced manufacturing capabilities, a lot of times if there's not an incentive for a business to incorporate it, that kind of, initial upfront investment is just not worth it. And a lot of those manufacturing capabilities are what are directly linked to being able to surge really fast, and especially with like a limited workforce. You can only add so many shifts onto an existing workforce. You only have so much production facility available. If we want that type of surge to be possible down the line, we have to put the funding forward to invest in these capabilities going into industry right now. And we can't expect them to just do it without us, without the government providing and incentivizing those kind of advancements. So I think that's a big part. I'll let John take the rest of the question.
Yeah. So
Katy, 1 minute left.
second that, Katy, ask for what you need. And then just one more specific example, include wartime needs in your life cycle sustainment plans. Closing comments, if I could do that, just one other theme I wanted to close with was the importance of culture and workforce. Vice Admiral English emphasized in one of his panels earlier, we are all war fighters. So this conversation, everybody on the call, we need to ask how we are going to actively go engage on this space. How do we pivot from what we have today, which is thinking in terms of compliance and design for peacetime efficiency? How do we pivot to going forward from what we've enjoyed over the last 80 years to a new mindset and operating model that goes from compliance to risk-based approaches. Focus on performance to focus on productivity or producibility. Exquisite and monolithic to affordable, modular, scalable solutions. Paper-based, transactional to model-based continuous collaboration. Traditional to commercial supply chain solutions. Program to product and as-a-service business models. And then my favorite theme to just finish off is we've done a lot of governing and managing and talking about the problem. It's time to do and deliver. It's the age of the doer. So let's get after it. Thank you.
Yeah, let's build together. And I would just close this panel out. Thank you so much, Katy and John, for participating. But it really is about this is Commander's business. It's not something that we can offload to somebody else, and we all need to put our shoulder to the wheel. So thank you so much for being part of this discussion today. Thanks, everyone, for being part of a great panel.